Welcome to Monologues by Hassie, where I'm going to be dropping unsolicited brain dumps from the depths of my grey matter. I'll talk about life, money, society, and self-development, plus whatever else lies up there, whilst hopefully not getting cancelled in the process. As of late, I've become very property obsessed. And when you're going through that period of your life, which I am, when you're looking to purchase your own home, you start thinking about mortgages. And for a lot of people, this is going to be the first time that they take on serious amounts of debt. And the topic of debt really got me thinking about debt in our society. Now, for those of you who've heard the myth of the Trojan horse story, as the story goes, you had the Greeks and the Trojans and they're at war. There's been a siege for a very long time, and how the Greeks finally win the war is by constructing a wooden horse, hiding all their troops inside, and the Trojans mistake this horse to be a present and they bring it into their city. At which time, the soldiers jump out of the horse and now they've penetrated the walls of Troy. And when I think about debt, if debt is misused improperly, it can be very much a Trojan horse in our lives. Because what we see on the outside, what we think is a gift, this giant wooden horse, ends up being something that we didn't expect it. And as I've been exploring the role of debt in society, and specifically consumer debt and housing debt for the house you live in, it's led me to observe a few things, both in my own journey to enter the housing market, and then just observing people around me. And what my opinion on the role of debt in society is that for most of us living in a capitalist economy, our societies incentivize us to take on as much debt as possible. And to be more specific about that, society wants as much of its working age population to be in as much debt as possible for as much time as possible. Now, why on earth would society want us to do that? And fundamentally, I believe it's because we get locked into the economic system. Think about it. If you're a relatively privileged young person, which I will say I am, I'll put that out there, in that you had a family, you had a house to live in, and until you took out your first mortgage, that's your first real big financial obligation. But if you look at your life, if you examine your life up until you do that, up until you make that big commitment to take on a mortgage, fundamentally, when you go to work, often you're going to work for a particular reason. You might be going to work because you want to learn skills. Maybe you really want to work for a particular company. There are so many different reasons why people go to work when they have the freedom to choose why they would work. And if you are fortunate enough, you might be in a situation where rather than working purely for survival, you might have some sort of other ambitions. It could be development, status. There's so many other things. There's so many factors which go into what might make a person want to work. But once you take on a significant debt, that changes. All of a sudden, you need to work. Work went from being an option, something that you did, which is a whole other, or do, which is a whole other story. But it now becomes something that you have to do. You have to work now because you need to maintain your repayments. And when I look at the narrative that's being pushed onto me from everyone I interact with in this process, from the banks to the mortgage brokers to friends and family giving advice, the general advice is go to the bank and find out what you can borrow and purchase a property that uses that entire capacity. If the bank tells you can borrow $1 million, go and buy $1 million house. And I think that is absolutely crazy. Again, from my own perspective. Now, the reason I think that's absolutely crazy is when you go to the bank and they assess you, they look at your income and they say, we're happy to lend you X amount. It could be $1 million. And fundamentally, they've worked out that's that's the most risk they're willing to take on you. But if I've observed anything about our society is debt has become so cheap that we allow people to take on a lot of it. Which is why if you live in a Western economy, there are many cities around the world in Western economies where housing has gone into an absolute bubble, and people say supply demand, and it's not as simple as a supply demand curve. We can't simply say that, well, there's more people, there's migration, therefore house prices have doubled every 5 or 7 years. I mean, the city I live in now, Sydney, the median house price, again, I don't know the exact figure, but it's not cheap. I think it might be approaching $1 million if it hasn't already passed. I know there's plenty of $1 million suburbs. And it's ludicrous when you think about it, because wage growth definitely hasn't kept up the growth of house prices. So what has caused house prices to rise? And it's the fact that debt has become very cheap. And this has always been my argument, is that as interest rates have come down, the primary driver for house price growth is people being able to borrow more money. Because when somebody buys that $1 million house, no way in hell do they have $1 million saved up in their bank account. That purchase is being enabled by banks allowing people to borrow more and more. So I did go on a bit of a tangent, but that being said, the reason society wants us to borrow as much as the bank will lend us, that's multifaceted. In economies, again, in cities like Sydney, in countries like Australia, a large part of what we do to generate wealth is to sell pieces of land to each other. So by taking out a very large loan and again assuming that the growth in the amount that banks are willing to lend us is proportional to the growth in the housing market, which is a fair assumption, we're almost helping to keep the scheme going. We're the greater fool at the time of borrowing. We are enabling those who borrowed before us to exit their positions. But in exchange for what? And again, I bring this back to the Trojan horse story. So we think what we're getting is a house, and it could be a very lovely house in a lovely suburb. That's all variable, that's all up in the air. But fundamentally, what we think we're getting and what we end up getting are two different things. Because when I've been running scenarios, if I look at the scenario where I borrow as much as I can and purchase as much house as I can, this means I'm in a situation. Now ignore the need to work, but it means that I can't drop my income. So if I'm earning a particular income, then I can't drop that. I'm now in a position where society has leverage over me. They have locked me into a minimum level of productivity that, my contribution to the GDP of Australia has to be $500,000 a year. Primarily because I've made that lock-in commitment. Now, of course, if your contribution to GDP is 500,000, you might not see that. You might only make 80,000. But fundamentally, by borrowing as much as you can, I'm now locked into society. I'm in this societal lock-in. So personally, I've made the decision to only borrow 30 to 40% of what the bank is willing to lend me. Again, because I inherently distrust society and I distrust the banks. I do not think that as a whole, either of these entities has our best interests at heart. Because debt, and not just housing debt, but if we broaden that around to consumer debt, car loans, taking out a phone on repayment, that we're bombarded with so much marketing to make us want to buy more goods and services and not necessarily things we need. Again, let's make a clear differentiation between needs. You might need a roof over your head, but do you need that 7-bedroom McMansion with a pool in the backyard? Like, where do we differentiate needs and wants? And that's going to change for each person. What I'm trying to get at, and this is very poorly thought out and very poorly explained, but I, as an individual, want to find a way to decouple myself as much as possible from our economic machine. That does not mean I don't want to participate in our economy, but I do not want to be in a position where debt obligations that I have signed onto now dictate a particular path for my lifestyle. A lifestyle where I now need to exchange 40 to 50 hours per week for the next 20 to 30 years. For what? To have a bigger house, to have more grass to mow? And this, idea. It has been a little bit controversial because I've definitely had some mortgage brokers question where I want to live. I've had many people in my life throw shade at the particular choices that I've decided to make. And by all means, I don't think there's anything wrong with borrowing to your maximum capacity and buying something nice. But what I'm trying to get across is, when we make that decision, we should really be aware of the Trojan horse. Because when we look at the house, we're looking at the exterior of the horse, and often what we do is we fail to look inside the Trojan horse and see the soldiers hiding inside, to see what society has planned for us. And very often, it is a commitment of at least 20 to 30 years to our economic machine. So that's food for thought. And again, each to their own. Personally, I do want to decouple myself. I want to keep the Trojan horse outside my walls for as long as possible. And if I do allow a Trojan horse to come in, maybe only a small one that I can handle when it does enter my walls, so it doesn't overwhelm my defenses. So that's all from me today. Let me know what you think about taking on debt, specifically mortgage debt. And if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear from you. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hassie. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favorite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhassie.com. Thanks for swinging by.